the presentation that I will like to do with you today actually follows the first one, the previous one by Professor Perrottino and Daniel Sarovic, in the sense that we tried to develop the same type of analysis, but in a comparative way, and try to put together an analytical framework for empirically studying to what extent parties digitalize their internal functioning in different countries in Europe. So yes, if you can already go to the next slide, please, thank you. So in order to explain how we came to this, it's important to remember that Oscar Barbera and I actually come from studying parties as organization even before any kind of digitalization occurred. And actually, we started working together on party primaries and democratic ways for selecting candidates and leaders in European parties. And that is why when we started to work on technological change, we were interested more on how parties use these kind of tools for their own internal organization, for their own internal functioning, and not just for communication, electoral marketing, and electoral campaigning. This actually is also reflected in the existing studies and scholarship and existing research on political parties and digital technologies. The research evolved together with the technological advancements. So from the first analysis that were focused on the use of digital tools for campaigning, for example, or recruiting members and communicating with them in a more permanent way through, for example, newsletters. This was linked to the technological advancements at the end of the 90s, early 2000s, where first all parties in Europe started to create their own websites, for example, or blogs. With the 2010s, this evolution in technological terms, with the emergence of social media, also reflected on the existing research on political parties by looking at the effects of the mainstream access to the internet and to the use of specific social media tools for mobilizing, communicating, and engaging with voters and members. During these first 20 years, so between the early 2000 to the end of 2010, most of the research actually was divided in two aspects, in two strands for assessing the impact of digital technology, especially on participation. So the most important thing, of course, for researchers and not only parties, as previous speeches also mentioned, was not only to understand how parties could communicate or mobilize electorally their voters or sympathizers, but actually how to enhance participation within the parties thanks to digital tools. This first part of research strands actually divided into two main subfields, sub-strands, meaning cyber-optimists and cyber-pessimists. So the first empirical studies on the use of digital technologies for parties actually try to assess to what extent the use of ICTs could have positive effects for increasing political participation within and around parties. So for recruiting more members, for mobilizing better their activists during electoral campaigns, and informing better their own voters. The first empirical research in these trends also has shown that technological change was also useful for increasing resources, so for allowing for digital fundraising, and we've seen a few examples of that already today. The second strand of research actually was way less optimistic about the potential impacts of technological change in the functioning of parties. The idea that was that there were several studies that pointed out negative consequences of digital transformations, in the sense that these patterns of disintermediation between the party grassroots and the leadership, thanks to digital technology, actually led to disempowerment of members, and actually strengthened these patterns of transforming the party base into cheerleaders that was already hypothesized by Katzenmeyer, for example, with their model of the cartel party, even before the advancements in online technologies. Other important elements that were shown by empirical analysis by cyber pessimists was the importance of the digital divide and how this can create inequalities among different types of party members that want to participate but cannot because of technological reasons. And the last part of empirical research on the negative impacts, potential negative impacts on digital technologies, try to underline the fact that online participation only rarely translated into offline mobilization of party activists and party sympathizers. If we can go now, please, to the next slide. Thank you, slide number 3. Thanks. So the empirical research went from trying to understand how party competition and campaigning transformed thanks to digital technologies. So the first books, the first researches published on this topic tries mostly to understand how ICTs can be used for fundraising, communication, electoral marketing, and campaigning tools, and to see how this can impact inter-party competition. And in this sense, there were two main hypotheses: the equalization hypothesis that suggests that the use of new technologies by smaller and new parties can compensate in political competition dynamics by making those new parties more challenging for traditional mainstream parties. At the same time, normalization hypotheses were also put forward by empirical analysis by interpreting in a more cautious way the effects of new technology in inter-party competition. What is less analyzed in empirical comparative party politics analysis is how all these technological changes actually impact on organizational issue, purely internal party functioning and intra-party democracy. So the idea for our book and our research was to try to go beyond the formulation of new party models. So the idea was to build on the digital party models, the e-democracy party model, the connective party models, and try to rather assess the extent, the degree of digitalization of internal party functions across Europe. So the idea was to focus on organizational dynamics and their changes thanks to information and communication technology, foreseeing how hierarchies within parties evolve due to technological change, how decision-making evolve, for example, with the progressive adoption of online participation platforms that we call OPS or OPPs in the book, for example, and how this can impact on internal party democracy and internal power relations between members, sympathizers, and party elites. And that is the basis of our book, which is called Digital Parties, The Challenges of Online Organization and Participation, that will be published, if everything goes well, in October by Springer. Before moving to the next slides that start to discuss the results of our analysis, it's important to remember that we started to work on the book in 2018, so well before the pandemic. So actually, this is a pre-pandemic book, and we are already working on new materials, new data collection to actually try to understand what happens within parties after a year and a half of pandemics that has moved, compelled many political actors to move online most of their functions, most of their functioning. So if we can go please to the next slide. This is a table that you can find in one of the chapter book, is actually developed by a colleague of ours, Jasmine Fitzpatrick from the University of Mainz in Germany. And this shows the 5 different pillars that are analyzed empirically in all the chapters of the book, meaning in each chapter we try to see how party membership is affected by digital technology, how the selection of leaders and candidates is affected by digital technology, how the elaboration of the policy program is affected by the use of digital technology, and also the public image of the party, meaning the party communication tools, websites, marketing tools, and also the resources, so the fundraising, but also how money is spent because and thanks to digital technologies. If we can go to the next slide, please. Thank you. So we try to provide in the book an empirical account of the degree of digitalization of political parties in several countries in Europe, in particular Czech Republic, Finland, Czech Republic, thanks to the work of Daniel Sarovec, Finland, France, Germany, Greece, Italy, Spain, and UK, but also Japan, to provide at least one empirical example outside Europe. And we look at how party digital platforms, especially participatory platforms, are created, developed, and how are internally regulated and used, both in new and mainstream parties. So we try to go beyond this dichotomy of analyzing those new commerce that at the end of the 2010 appeared in many countries in Europe, meaning completely native digital parties, like, for example, the pirate parties, both in Czech Republic and in Germany, but also the German Greens to some extent, digitalized faster than other parties, Podemos in Spain, the Five Star Movement in Italy, Razem in Poland, or Alternativet in Denmark, for example. All those parties use from their creation entirely digitalized party organizations. And in our book, they are analyzed together with mainstream parties that existed well before the creation of digital technologies, to see how those patterns of digitalization vary or converge across party types. So the most relevant finding in the book, of course, is not surprising, even before the pandemic, is that all political parties operating in the democracies that we analyzed have, to some extent, digitalized not only their communication, their electoral marketing, but also their organization. Of course, there is huge variation across parties and across countries that are analyzed, but there is at least some basic level of digitalization in all European countries. There are 3 main points that emerge from the empirical analysis we conduct in our book. Of course, there's a difference in the degree and patterns and models of digitalization between new digitally native parties and mainstream parties. We looked at mainstream parties both at national but also regional level, for example, in Spain, especially in Southern Europe then. And mainstream political parties we found are embracing digitalization not as an essential feature of their organizational settings, but as an additional tool with an incremental, let's say, use of digitalization technologies rather than radical changes. This makes sense because, of course, mainstream parties have slowly adapted their organization to the digital world and have been way less vulnerable when facing organizational crises that have also faced newer parties, especially those that are born as digital natives, that face at the same time the constraints of building a new organization that did not exist before and the challenges associated with digitalization. So being a mainstream party, being a consolidated institutionalized parties makes it easier to choose, pick and choose which are the tools that are better, more suited to the type of organization, to the type of needs of the party, and to limit, let's say, the negative impacts of digitalization within party internal functioning. Of course, new parties as the German, Finnish, and Czech pirate parties, Podemo, La France Insoumise, or Five Star Movement, have migrated entirely their not only external communication, but also their own decision-making and policy-making systems entirely online. However, the disparity between those two party types, mainstream and new parties, might start to weaken in the last 2 to 3 years, even before the pandemic, because even some well-established, well-institutionalized mainstream political parties, such as, for example, the Spanish Social Democrats, the PSOE, also are embracing digital disruptive innovations, such as internet voting, for example, on internal referenda. And that's also the case to some extent of, for example, the German Social Democrats too. So most of the studied mainstream parties promote incremental changes by developing, for example, online participatory platforms that are endowed with more deliberative affordances. So they allow for membership and support and deliberation, but they have less often also decision-making affordances. So the process of internal decision-making is more in the hands of a more traditional offline processes. Second point, there's an important role, at least from the research side of things, of ideology as a driver of party digitalization. A common expectation in the literature has to do with the role of ideology as a driver of party digitalization, because researchers expect that left-wing party members will be more prone to political participation in general, and therefore they will be more willing to demand the strengthening of internal party democracy and horizontal communication through online participation platforms. On the other hand, right and radical wing parties are less concerned overall with internal participation, and therefore they will be less interested in strengthening that side of digital transformation. The evidence that comes from the book is in line with this kind of expectation. So online participatory platforms have mostly been developed by mainstream social democratic or more often new radical or regional left parties, with some exceptions, of course. For example, there are some center or center-right parties that are fairly digitalized, like La República March or Ciudadanos in Spain. New center-right parties like, for example, the Catalan Independentist PDeCAT or the new Valencian radical left Compromís also have substantially migrated most of their internal function to the digital. But that is not the case, for example, for more conservative and older parties like the Basque nationalists, PNV. All in all, we can see from the book that there are two, let's say, subtypes of digital parties that emerge. Personalistic authoritarian subtypes that relies on the relevance of top-down plebiscitarian digital decision-making, where the intensive use of new technology is used mostly to mobilize party members and followers. This is the case, for example, of the Japanese parties that are analyzed in the book. And the second subtype is the connective digital party, which stresses the use of digital technology for enhancing internal participation and bottom-up decision-making systems. Like, for example, it is the case in German Greens and German Pirates, Finnish and Czech Pirates, and, for example, in France, La France Insoumise. If we can go on the last slide, I will try to discuss this very quickly. This is a very long discussion in the book about what can we learn from these empirical analysis in terms of, we measure the features of the parties as digitalized organization. What we need to study even more are the challenges, the problems that come with this kind of digitalization features, and especially also the consequences. For example, in the first column, we see the list of all the challenges that can come with the digitalization of party platform and public image tools, so websites and Facebook fan pages, for example, of the parties. This is important because the type of access to this platform, to these social media pages, varies according to the type of members. So some members have full access to the platform, sympathizers only to some extent, etc., etc. And this has an impact on how we can use, how the party can use these kind of features for strengthening the quality, but also the quantity of available information. And this has an impact on how party members and sympathizers trust and engage with the party, because depends on the type of access they are granted to those platforms for internal participation. Another important challenge is the one of linked to the security and the type of software and ownership of the platforms. And in the book, there's several chapters that are dedicated to the discussion of, for example, the example of the five-star movement. The part is a clear example of how issues of security, internal regulation, software ownership are crucial for making sure that the party platform function as expected. For example, the basic problem of the five-star movement, but I think there was already a session of these conferences on the party, but just for a quick example, the problem of the five-star movement is that the party lacks democratic control over its own platform that is managed by a private company, and they lost entirely any kind of control on the platform last month in May 2021, when the party split into two. The second column deals with the challenges concerning membership, meaning that we need to pay attention as a researchers on how the integration and participation of party members is managed, because this can result in a empowerment of members or in a transformation of members, as we were saying at the beginning, into cheerleader groups without any real power. The third column concerns the internal use of digital technologies for decision-making and internal power organization. And it's important to remember that an important number of new but also mainstream parties have moved online most of their internal voting procedures for selecting, for example, the party leaders. We have seen some example before. These initiatives were also used not only by fully digital parties like Podemos or the Pirates, but also by mainstream parties like, for example, the Spanish Social Democrats. what is important to remember here is that there are crucial technical standards that must be respected in order to be sure that digital voting is fair, is transparent, is secure, and cannot be tampered with from internal or external actors. And the last column on the right concern policymaking, in the sense that from our study, we can show that online participation platforms have not only implemented voting affordances, so internal voting structures, but also in several cases, the use of digital technologies have changed the way in which parties engage in policymaking, in the sense that some new and mainstream parties have encouraged party membership engagement in policy development, in creating new policies, policy proposals, by reserving specific spaces within their digital platform for collective law proposal writing, for example. What is important to study now, is how these collective initiatives for drafting law proposal are controlled by party elites, meaning the agenda setting stage of this kind of policymaking participatory initiative is crucial, and it's important to understand to what extent members can really act bottom up to propose new policy initiative, and to what extent the control over the agenda setting is still tightly in the hands of party elites. This is important for understanding not only the impact of this kind of participatory initiatives on internal party functioning, but for assessing the overall democratic quality of party organization. If we can go to the very last slide, I will now conclude. So you can find general discussion of all the items in the table I showed you in the book that will come out in October. But what we know now is that there's a huge variation. There are some trends, some patterns that emerge according to the party family and to the party origin. So there's a difference between new and mainstream parties. But the problem is that this book has been written before the pandemic. And what we need to do now is to try to assess which kind of digital transformation that have been adopted during the COVID crisis have been actually considered effective by parties, and that have been maintained or are planned to be kept in the next few years, because they are useful even beyond pandemic times. The other aspect that still need to be researched is the aspect of the social consequences of those technological changes for the internal organizational features of party, meaning to what extent are these political organization transformation effective in reconnecting intermediary organizations like political parties with citizens. So all those changes, all those participatory initiatives are actually used by citizens, and to what extent these can reinforce or transform the role of parties in contemporary society.